In the late 1990s, inside a British school computer room, a teacher quietly unplugged a final Acorn Archimedes and replaced it with a beige Windows PC. The machine was dragged to a storage closet. Once the absolute pride of the UK education system, boasting lightning-fast graphics and a revolutionary operating system, it had lost its market share to the relentless spread of global software standards. The classrooms that Acorn built were now dominated by Microsoft and IBM clones. Pupils lost a familiar machine. An entire ecosystem of local developers and educational software was quietly erased from the curriculum. But inside that discarded plastic case lay a paradox. The processor powering that failed desktop, the ARM chip, consumed so little power and ran so efficiently that it was about to conquer the entire mobile world. The story of Acorn is not just about a discontinued machine. It is the story of how a small Cambridge office built the architecture of the future, put it inside a classroom, and then lost the company that made it. Every week we explore the machines, platforms, and lost high street empires that defined British technology, and the systemic shifts that left them behind. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Cambridge in 1981. In the late 1970s, the British high street did not yet sell the future. Computers were industrial monoliths, hidden away in university labs, corporate data centers, or government facilities. A microcomputer, a small, relatively inexpensive computer built around a single microprocessor, designed for an individual to use, was still a niche pursuit. It was something built by hobbyists with soldering irons on kitchen tables, not something a family bought in a shop. But in Cambridge, a quiet revolution was beginning to take physical shape. In 1978, Hermann Hauser, an Austrian physicist, and Chris Curry, a British engineer, founded a company called Acorn. Curry had previously worked alongside the brilliant but notoriously difficult inventor Clive Sinclair. The departure was not amicable. It birthed a fierce local rivalry that would eventually accelerate the entire British computing industry. Acorn's early machines, like the Acorn System 1, were aimed at engineers and serious electronics enthusiasts. They were bare circuit boards completely unapproachable to the general public. But the market was shifting rapidly. By the turn of the decade, the British government and the national broadcaster recognized a looming industrial crisis. They feared that Britain, the country that had pioneered early computing with machines like the Colossus and the Manchester Baby, was about to be left behind by American and Japanese manufacturers. To solve this, the BBC announced the Computer Literacy Project. It was an unprecedented public service initiative. The broadcaster planned to produce a television series that would teach the British public how to understand and write code. But to do that, they needed a standard hardware platform. They needed a school computer, a machine bought specifically for classrooms, lessons, and local education programs, making digital literacy a public promise rather than a private luxury. The BBC issued a fiercely demanding specification. They required a machine capable of high-resolution graphics, fast processing, and complex expandability. It had to be physically robust enough to survive a classroom full of children, and versatile enough to be programmed in a structured language. Clive Sinclair, whose company had already achieved commercial momentum with cheap, accessible machines, believed the contract was rightfully his. He presented his upcoming hardware, assuming his market presence and aggressive pricing would secure the deal. Acorn, by comparison, was smaller and less proven at scale. But Hauser and Curry were determined not to let Sinclair win. When the BBC visited Acorn in early 1981, they expected to see a working prototype. Acorn did not actually have one. They only had a concept on paper, internally named the Acorn Proton. With the BBC returning in exactly 1 week to evaluate the physical hardware, Acorn had just 7 days to build a machine that did not yet exist. The sheer panic of that week would decide who owned the British classroom. The team at Acorn, led by brilliant engineers like Sophie Wilson and Steve Ferber, practically lived in the office. They worked relentlessly, relying on sheer adrenaline and wire-wrapping components by hand. Wilson designed the operating system, the core software that manages the computer and lets other programs run, while Ferber built the physical architecture. It was a chaotic, exhausted push to turn a paper specification into a physical machine. When Sunday arrived, the prototype was finally assembled. It worked. The BBC delegation walked into the Cambridge office on Monday morning. They were greeted by a machine that had not existed a week earlier. Sinclair had offered a cheaper, mass-market solution, but Acorn offered something entirely different. They presented a machine that was deliberately over-engineered. This was a pivotal decision for British technology. Acorn refused to cut corners on the hardware. The BBC specification demanded high-resolution graphics, teletext capabilities, and an array of connection ports at the back. Acorn delivered all of it. They included connections for cassette tapes, magnetic tape used by many home computers to load and save programs before disks became standard, and a revolutionary interface known as the tube, which allowed the machine to connect to additional, more powerful processors in the future. They had built a machine designed not just to play games, but to interface with the real world, to control robotic arms, to measure temperature in science labs, to connect to the emerging networks of the 1980s. But this ambition came with a severe risk. The Acorn machine was expensive. While Clive Sinclair was preparing to sell computers for under £100, the new Acorn machine would cost nearly £400 for the high-end model. In the early 1980s, that was a massive financial commitment for any British family or local education authority. Yet the strategy worked. The BBC did not want a cheap toy. They wanted a robust, expandable platform that could serve as a national standard for a decade. The sheer quality of the Acorn Proton won the contract. In late 1981, the Acorn Proton was officially renamed. It became the BBC microcomputer. Attaching the BBC logo to a commercial product was almost unprecedented. The British Broadcasting Corporation was a trusted public service institution. By putting its name on the heavy beige plastic case, the BBC essentially told the British public that this was the definitive, approved way to understand the future. But winning the contract was only a piece of paper. The real test was physical, logistical, and brutal. Acorn now had to manufacture tens of thousands of complex machines. They had to source chips, plastics, and components in the middle of a global semiconductor shortage. Early production was plagued by delays. The custom chips required for the machine's advanced graphics took longer to perfect than anticipated. The BBC Computer Literacy Project was scheduled to broadcast, and the accompanying television series, The Computer Program, was ready to go to air. The public was waiting. Teachers who had never touched a keyboard in their lives were preparing lesson plans based on a machine that was struggling to leave the factory line. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked as though Acorn might fail to deliver the very public service promise they had fought so hard to win. They eventually solved the manufacturing bottlenecks, but the pressure of the supply chain had almost broken them before they even started. The machine had passed the test. Now it had to survive the classroom. When the BBC Micro finally began to arrive in British classrooms and living rooms in early 1982, it immediately felt different from its competitors. It was a heavy, imposing wedge of beige plastic, visually defined by a distinctive strip of bright red function keys across the top. Unlike the rubbery, calculator-like keys of Sinclair's cheaper machines, the BBC Micro featured a robust, mechanical keyboard. It felt like a serious piece of industrial equipment, built specifically to survive the aggressive daily typing of 1,000 pupils. Turning it on became a generational ritual. There was no loading animation, no soft welcome melody. The machine simply delivered a harsh, dual-tone beep, and the television screen flashed instantly to a stark text prompt, BBC Computer 32K. To understand what that meant is to understand how constrained early computing was. Memory, the fast temporary storage a computer uses while programs are running, was incredibly scarce. With just 32 kilobytes of RAM in the standard Model B, a pupil had barely enough digital space to store a few pages of plain text. Every line of code, every graphic, and every command had to be ruthlessly efficient. The brain of the machine was similarly restricted. The processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions, was a standard 2 MHz MOS 6502 chip. It possessed a fraction of the power found in a modern digital watch, but in 1982 it dictated exactly how quickly a teenager could command a pixel to move across a cathode ray tube display. But the BBC Micro was not left in a vacuum. The hardware was supported by a massive cultural apparatus. In January 1982, the BBC broadcast the computer program. Presenters stood in front of millions of British viewers, using the BBC Micro to explain how the modern world was being rewritten. They did not just show games. They showed the machine controlling model trains, managing databases, and drawing complex geometric shapes. It was not merely a television show. It was a televised national curriculum, turning a complicated piece of Cambridge engineering into a household talking point. For the teenagers who managed to get a machine at home, the bedroom desk changed its function. It became a place of intense, frustrating focus. Software was primarily distributed on cassette tape, standard magnetic audio tape used by many early home computers to load and save programs before floppy disks became affordable. A program did not simply open, it arrived through sound. A user would type the load command, press play on a standard tape recorder, and wait for up to 10 minutes, listening to a harsh digital screech, praying that the volume was set correctly and the code would load without crashing. The BBC Micro taught the country that computing required patience, precision, and a willingness to understand the machine on its own terms. And as the production lines finally caught up with the overwhelming demand, the machine prepared to enter the most important arena of all, the local education authority. In the early 1980s, standardizing computing education across Britain was a massive logistical challenge. Computers were still widely viewed as luxury items or specialist industrial tools. A local education authority, the council department responsible for managing public school budgets, had to justify spending nearly £400 on a single machine when head teachers were already struggling to afford standard textbooks. To solve this, the Department of Industry introduced a government subsidy scheme, offering to pay half the cost of a microcomputer for every secondary school, and later, every primary school. Head teachers were given a choice between a few approved machines, including models from Research Machines and Sinclair. But despite the lower price tags of its rivals, the overwhelming majority chose the BBC Micro. It was the safe, broadcaster-approved choice. The machine physically reshaped the school environment. Because a school could often only afford 1 or 2 units, the BBC Micro was usually strapped to a sturdy metal television trolley and wheeled carefully between classrooms. It was frequently paired with a cub monitor, a square, reliable color display, and an external floppy disk drive. This drive was a heavy, expensive mechanical unit that read magnetic 5.25-inch disks, allowing teachers to load lesson software in seconds rather than enduring the chaotic, error-prone unreliability of a cassette tape. The true brilliance of the machine lay in BBC Basic, a highly structured, exceptionally fast version of the standard programming language, built directly into the computer's permanent memory. When a pupil turned the machine on, they were not presented with a menu of ready-made apps. They were dropped directly into a coding environment. BBC Basic allowed users to write simple text programs, but it also included a unique feature that let advanced teenagers write code that spoke directly to the bare metal of the processor. It turned curiosity into engineering. An entire domestic ecosystem of British software houses emerged strictly to feed this hardware. Educational adventures, like Granny's Garden, became a shared cultural memory for millions of pupils, teaching logic and problem-solving through simple text and blocky graphics. Meanwhile, bedroom developers pushed the architecture to its absolute limit. When 2 Cambridge students released Elite in 1984, a wireframe 3D space trading game that crammed an entire mathematically generated galaxy into just 32 kilobytes. It proved that the BBC Micro was not just a dry educational tool. It was a machine capable of profound technical magic. By the mid-1980s, roughly 80% of British schools had chosen the BBC Micro. It was no longer just a product, it was national infrastructure. It meant that a pupil in a wealthy London suburb and a pupil in a working-class northern estate were learning the exact same digital logic on the exact same heavy mechanical keyboard. Acorn had secured its massive user base through public service trust. The classroom belonged to Acorn, but to keep it, the company had to solve a physical problem that was about to hit a wall. By 1985, Acorn had reached a height of cultural and educational dominance that no other British technology company had ever achieved. The BBC Micro was not just a successful product, it was the default language of British computing. Look inside almost any secondary school, and you would find the dedicated ICT room, the Information and Communication Technology Suite. These rooms possessed a specific, unforgettable atmosphere. They were often too warm, humming with the high-pitched static of dozens of Microvitec Cub monitors, filled with the aggressive mechanical clatter of Acorn keyboards, and the heavy metallic clunk of 5.25-inch floppy disk drives locking into place. In a British school where one computer might serve a room full of pupils, the right machine did not merely run software. It decided who first saw code move on a screen, who discovered games as systems, who imagined work beyond the high street, and who felt that the future had finally entered the classroom. Acorn was printing money. They expanded their ecosystem with a vast array of physical peripherals, third-party hardware expansions, and a thriving publishing industry led by thick, code-filled magazines like Acorn User, stacked high on W.H. Smith shelves. The peak of this public service ambition arrived in 1986 with the BBC Domesday Project. To commemorate the 900th anniversary of the original Domesday Book, over 1 million British schoolchildren collected local data, photographs, and accounts of everyday life. To process and display this vast digital archive, Acorn built a highly specialized system, pairing an upgraded BBC Micro with a massive, incredibly expensive Philips LaserVision disc player. It was a triumph of educational technology, placing a searchable map of the entire nation into the hands of teenagers. But inside the Cambridge headquarters, the engineers knew a harsh truth. The Domesday Project was a brilliant achievement, but it also exposed the fact that the hardware was dying. The heart of the BBC Micro was the 6502 processor, an 8-bit architecture, meaning it processed data in tiny, 8 binary digit chunks. It was a masterpiece of late 1970s engineering, but it was physically hitting a wall. Software was becoming more complex. Users wanted graphical user interfaces, multitasking, and advanced networking. An 8-bit chip simply could not move enough data, quickly enough, to render the next generation of computing. The machine was groaning under the weight of the data it was being asked to manage. To survive the next decade, Acorn needed a 32-bit processor, a chip capable of handling vastly larger chunks of information simultaneously, allowing for fluid graphics and complex real-time calculations. They had built the most important machine in Britain, but they were about to become obsolete in their own classrooms if they did not evolve. The logical step, the step every other computer manufacturer in Europe took, was to buy an off-the-shelf chip from an American giant. Acorn executives looked at Intel's offerings. They visited the United States to examine the Motorola 68000, the advanced processor that would go on to power the Apple Macintosh, the Commodore Amiga, and the Sega Mega Drive. But Herman Hauser, Sophie Wilson, and Steve Ferber found these American chips profoundly disappointing. They were massive, complicated, power-hungry, and crucially, they were slow to respond to hardware interrupts. The vital electronic signals that tell a processor to pause what it is doing and handle an immediate real-world task, like reading a rapid keystroke or managing a network packet. Acorn's entire engineering philosophy, born from the strict, demanding requirements of the BBC contract, was built on immediate, real-time responsiveness. If they used a standard American chip, they would lose the very speed and elegance that made the BBC Micro brilliant. But designing a new microprocessor from scratch was an undertaking normally reserved for multinational corporations with billion-dollar research budgets and massive semiconductor fabrication plants. Acorn was a company of a few hundred people operating out of Cambridge office blocks. Yet driven by the sheer arrogance of brilliant engineering, they decided that if the global market did not have the chip they needed, they would simply invent it themselves. The decision to build a custom microprocessor inside a small Cambridge office was bordering on technological madness. The task fell primarily to two brilliant engineers, Sophie Wilson, who designed the instruction set, and Steve Ferber, who translated that mathematical logic into physical silicon architecture. They chose to base their new processor on an emerging, radical concept called RISC. RISC, reduced instruction, set computing, was an architecture that stripped away complex, rarely used processor commands, forcing the chip to execute only very simple instructions, but at a blisteringly fast speed. By focusing strictly on what the processor did most often, Wilson and Ferber could make the physical silicon smaller, cooler, and dramatically more efficient than the sprawling, complicated chips built by Intel and Motorola. The project was named the Acorn RISC machine, or ARM. In April 1985, the first test chips, manufactured by their partner VLSI Technology, arrived back in Cambridge. When they plugged the very first ARM processor into a test circuit board, it worked instantly. But as they ran their diagnostics, the engineering team noticed something impossible. The ammeter, the device measuring the electrical current flowing directly into the chip, registered absolute zero. For a moment, they thought the meter was broken. Then they realized the truth. The ARM chip consumed so little power that it was functioning entirely on the faint, ambient electrical leakage from the surrounding circuits on the motherboard. It did not even need its primary power pins connected to run. This staggering, accidental power efficiency was not what Acorn was actively looking for. They only wanted a fast processor for a desktop machine. But that exact physical trait would eventually dictate the future of global technology. For now, however, Acorn just needed it to power a British computer. In 1987, they launched the Acorn Archimedes. It was a physical departure from the heavy beige wedges of the early 1980s. The Archimedes looked like a serious, modern workstation. It featured a separate mechanical keyboard, a unique 3-button mouse, and a sleek central unit. Inside, it ran on the new ARM architecture, making it a true 32-bit powerhouse. To navigate this incredible speed, Acorn eventually developed RISC OS, a completely graphical operating system that lived directly on the machine's internal memory chips. Because the core software did not have to be loaded from a slow mechanical hard drive, the Archimedes booted almost instantly. To demonstrate exactly what this British engineering could do, a young programmer named David Braben, co-creator of the legendary game Elite, released a title for the Archimedes called Zark. It was a visual shock. Zark offered a fully three-dimensional, fluidly moving landscape where the player piloted a mouse-controlled craft. It rendered shadows, hills, and hundreds of moving particles in real time. If a British pupil walked into a high-street computer shop in 1987 and saw Zark running smoothly on an Archimedes screen, while a vastly more expensive American IBM-compatible PC struggled to render blocky static text, the gap in capability looked like absolute magic. By the late 1980s, the Archimedes began to proudly take its place in the school ICT room, sitting on desks where the BBC Micro had once ruled. Acorn had successfully transitioned from the 8-bit era. They had retained their reputation for elite hardware. Acorn had built the fastest computer in the world for its class. But a brilliant machine was about to collide with a ruthless market. The first crack in the British home computer boom was almost invisible. It did not arrive with a dramatic boardroom collapse or a sudden bankruptcy filing, but with a quiet change in the rhythm of high-street retail windows across the United Kingdom. In late 1984, buyers walking past branches of W.H. Smith, John Menzies, and Dixon's in cities from Manchester to Bristol began to notice a subtle shift in the displays. The front shelves, once dominated entirely by cassette-based 8-bit machines like the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, were slowly sharing space with imported Japanese consoles and bulkier, business-oriented hardware. The machines that had turned British bedrooms into digital workshops were no longer the undisputed center of consumer electronics. Behind this retail hesitation lay a deeper structural pressure. Manufacturing costs, component supply chains, and shrinking profit margins on low-cost hardware. A home computer, a computer sold for household use, often connected to a television and loaded with software from tape, disc, or cartridge, had survived on high-volume sales at remarkably thin profit margins. When component prices fluctuated and assembly bottlenecks delayed shipments to regional warehouses, the financial cushion of a British hardware pioneer began to fray. The pressure intensified with the arrival of the Sinclair QL in 1984, a personal computer designed for serious home and small business users, built around a 32-bit, 16-bit Motorola 68008 processor. Rushed to market to beat competing corporate machines, the QL suffered from unrefined operating system software, production delays, and unreliable microdrive storage units. Early buyers found themselves acting as involuntary testers for a machine that promised professional computing power before its hardware ecosystem was fully stable. That misstep exposed a critical vulnerability in the British home computer model: the gap between ambitious engineering and reliable mass manufacturing. While Sinclair Research invested heavily in futuristic projects like the Sinclair C5 electric vehicle, a battery-powered single-seat trike that failed to capture the British commuter market, the core computing market was shifting beneath its feet. By 1985, the educational and domestic landscape was no longer waiting exclusively for British 8-bit innovation. Schools that had once built entire computer clubs around single-machine setups were beginning to look at more standardized hardware architectures. Teachers, local education authorities, and institutional buyers needed machines with robust networking capabilities, dependable disk drives, and stable software support that did not require loading games or programs from magnetic cassette tape. Magnetic tape used by many home computers to load and save programs before disks became standard. Simultaneously, the developer ecosystem that had kept the British bedroom coding phenomenon alive began to feel the gravitational pull of a new generation of hardware. Software houses in Liverpool, Sheffield, and London found their audiences demanding richer graphics, larger memory capacity, and faster processing speeds than the original 8-bit architecture could comfortably deliver. The market was moving towards 16-bit platforms, such as the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga, alongside IBM-compatible personal computers running Microsoft software. These global standards offered developers standardized operating systems, the core software that manages the computer and lets other programs run, and more predictable commercial returns. For Sinclair, the burden of supporting an aging product line while funding ambitious, unproven diversification proved unsustainable. The company had built a cultural movement on affordable, clever British engineering, but it had not built the capital reserves required to survive a rapid generational shift in global technology standards. In April 1986, the inevitable financial reckoning arrived in a form few bedroom coders could have predicted. Sinclair Research sold its entire computer product range, brand name, and associated intellectual property to Amstrad, a rival British consumer electronics company known for low-cost manufacturing and aggressive high-street distribution. The transaction did not simply transfer ownership of a machine. It marked the moment when independent British home computer manufacturing surrendered to industrial consolidation. The machines would still be built and sold under familiar brand badges, but the era of visionary, high-risk bedroom computing pioneers was drawing to a close. The machine worked. The market around it had already begun to change. By the early 1990s, the macroeconomic reality had closed in. The structural forces that had nurtured Acorn in its golden age, enthusiastic local education authorities, a protected public service curriculum, and independent British innovation, were systematically dismantled by global economics. The primary pressure came from the standardization of personal computing around the American corporate model. The global market had settled on IBM-compatible architectures running MS-DOS and Microsoft Windows. Software developers could not afford to write code for a niche, proprietary operating system used primarily in British classrooms when they could write once for a global platform that dominated offices worldwide. Acorn's technological edge, the ARM chip, was ironically too valuable to be locked inside failing desktop hardware. In 1990, Acorn made a strategic pivot that would define the rest of computer history. They spun off the ARM design team into an independent company, ARM Holdings, in a joint venture with Apple and VLSI Technology. The desktop hardware division, however, was left behind to fight a losing battle in an unyielding market. Olivetti, the Italian industrial giant that had acquired a controlling stake in Acorn years earlier, watched as school budgets dried up and local councils bowed to pressure from parents and head teachers demanding Microsoft Windows training for their children. The classrooms that had once echoed with the startup beep of the BBC Micro and the quiet hum of the Archimedes were steadily cleared out. The transformation happened school by school, council by council. The beige boxes were disconnected. The monitors were stacked in corridors. The disk drives were thrown into skips. The magazine advertisements vanished. The software shelves emptied. The high street displays moved on. The classrooms filled with Windows PCs. The brand was sold. The hardware stopped. The company dissolved. The chip took over the world. The corporate life of Acorn Computers did not end with a sudden explosion. It ended with a quiet, lingering corporate fragmentation. By the late 1990s, as Olivetti restructured its holdings and the high street retail landscape shifted decisively towards standard Windows PCs, the Cambridge Pioneer was dismantled. The brand name was sold off, the factory assembly lines fell silent, and the heavy beige boxes that had defined a decade of British education were steadily uninstalled from school ICT rooms across the United Kingdom. Yet the physical demise of Acorn's desktop hardware masked a profound, invisible survival. While the company itself could not weather the dramatic shift in global desktop standards, the architecture it had engineered out of stubborn brilliance lived on. The ARM processor, the low-power chip designed by Sophie Wilson and Steve Ferber to keep a desktop responsive, escaped the physical confines of the Cambridge office. Spun off into ARM Holdings in 1990, the technology was licensed out to global semiconductor manufacturers, eventually finding its way into mobile phones, digital cameras, handheld consoles, and modern smartphones. Today, that exact architectural logic powers over 90% of all mobile devices on Earth. Every time a text message is sent, a digital photograph is captured, or a mobile screen lights up, it runs on a direct descendant of the engineering philosophy forged during a frantic 7-day prototype push in a Cambridge office in 1981. The company that built the British school system vanished from the high street, but the processor it created became the invisible operating engine of the modern global economy. For those who lived through the era, the preservation of that history has become a quiet act of cultural recovery and technical archiving. Across the United Kingdom, specialist institutions and enthusiast groups keep the legacy breathing. At the National Museum of Computing, located at Bletchley Park, and the Center for Computing History in Cambridge, rows of BBC Micros and Acorn Archimedes machines are meticulously maintained. Volunteers clean yellowed plastic casings, repair failing power supplies, and load vintage software from floppy disks and cassette tapes. Magnetic tape used by many home computers to load and save programs before disks became standard. These places do more than display old electronics. They preserve a specific moment when computing felt like a public service promise rather than a corporate utility. The original machines still matter because they represent a rare era when a nation decided that digital literacy should be taught in every classroom, regardless of local postcode or background. A pupil sitting in a drafty secondary school in Cornwall and another in a packed London comprehensive learned the exact same BBC basic code on the exact same heavy mechanical keyboard. That shared national foundation created an entire generation of British engineers, developers, and system architects who learned how machines worked by taking them apart and rebuilding them from the metal up. A curious historical footnote remains hidden within this high-stakes transition. When Acorn engineers designed the original ARM instruction set in 1983, they did so using simple graph paper and hand-calculated logic, operating with a tiny budget and zero expectation that their work would ever leave the county of Cambridgeshire. They were simply trying to build a faster chip for a desktop computer that was struggling to keep pace with the commercial market. They had no idea that their academic exercise would eventually outlive the very desktop industry that funded it. The wider trajectory of Acorn offers a clear lesson in the economics of technology. Britain did not lack inventive genius, engineering rigor, or public service vision. The story of Acorn proves that a small team in Cambridge could outthink the largest corporations in the world and lay the technical foundation for the mobile age. But it also demonstrates that brilliant engineering alone cannot survive when global manufacturing, scales, retail standards, and consumer distribution shift toward massive international ecosystems. The classroom remembered the machine longer than the industry did. The brand was acquired, split, and scattered, But the physical legacy of those red function keys and stark text prompts remains etched into the collective memory of anyone who ever waited 10 harsh minutes for a cassette tape to load. Somewhere in a British loft, an old BBC Micro still rests inside a softened cardboard box, the red function keys dulled by decades of classroom typing, waiting for a cassette tape that once made an entire generation believe they could write the future. See you in the next video.